All right. So, good Saturday morning, everybody. I'm back again, of course, talking with more fish. And once again, just to intro what sort of goes on here, uh, this is a series that we've been doing now. Let's see, this is our fourth week, I believe, of this. Yep, fourth week. And basically, what the point of these series are is to highlight different groups of fishes that we have here in Minnesota. And these talks are being sponsored or funded by, I don't know, sponsor is exactly the right word. We have a grant through the Audubon Society, through the No Child Left Inside program, where basically the intent is to do programming that encourages people, especially people with kids, to go out and engage with Minnesota's nature in various ways. And so we're here to teach people a little bit about and encourage people to go out and do some fishing. And sort of the broader intent of it is if people are going out and they're engaging with the nature in a way that is bringing them close to it, they're more likely to want to do things that are healthy for it and want to protect it themselves later on, later on in life. And so the hope is that if we get people out fishing, get people out hiking, get people out, etc., etc., like I said, especially when they're young, those kids will grow up and become good stewards of nature later, is sort of the broader idea of it. And so, just a heads up, as far as our streaming audience here goes, there are a couple live folks here, and again, for our live folks, I mentioned this earlier, but there is also the camera and the microphone going in here, so just a heads up on that. If you ask a question, it might get picked up on the microphone here. Similarly, we might have people moving in and out, and so not a huge deal. We are open today. The Headwater Science Center is, of course, open 7 days a week. Monday through Saturday, we are open 9:30 to 5, and then on Sundays, we're open 1 to 5, so come by after lunch on Sunday. But anyway, we talked sunfish week 1. We talked also sunfish, but we called them the untrue sunfishes, bass and crappies mainly. Week 2, we talked perches week 3. And I think one of the things that's kind of cool about the perches is that sort of one of the trends we've been going through is the fish we've been talking about have started out very round and have been getting sort of longer and thinner as we go. And in fact, one of the things that you'll hear people sometimes refer to, especially walleye, people will call them walleye pike, even though they're not technically pike. Pike are a specific group of fish, and we have 3 different species of pike that can be found in Minnesota. Realistically, you're only going to probably ever encounter 2 of them. But we do have 3 species here in Minnesota. And pike are some of my favorite. Like when I talk about my fishing experience that I've had here in Minnesota, most of the time I've spent fishing has been either for bass or pike. And so this is, one of the ones where I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable with. Maybe those of you who have been watching these over time maybe gleaned that I don't do a whole lot of fishing for like walleye and sauger and stuff like that. But pike is something that I very much grew up fishing for. This is my kind of my wheelhouse as far as actually going fishing. So let's get started. I mentioned that there are 3 different species of pike that you can find in Minnesota. Of course, you have the northern pike, the muskellunge, and then we do have them. We are part of the range for them. I've never caught one in Minnesota. I've caught them in other places, but I've never caught one in Minnesota. They just like barely make it way into the southeast part of the state. They're like in Mississippi River. We're like kind of right at the Iowa border. In fact, even when I was like digging up info for grass pickerel, I rely a lot on like DNR info for a lot of the stuff that I use during these talks, but for the grass pickerel, I was having to go down to Iowa and Indiana's DNR to find info about them. But yeah, kind of limited compared to some of the other ones that we've talked about so far. In fact, I was even like debating not putting the grass pickerel in this talk because they're so uncommon in Minnesota. But then I was like, do I really want to do one of these on just 2 species when every other one I've done so far has talked about, 4 or more basically. So we threw the grass pickerel in there. And the one you're seeing in the picture here is of course a northern pike. One of the interesting things about this group of fish is that they are all part of what we call the same genus. It's a genus called Essox is the genus. I don't know the names of all of them off the top of my head, but I know northern pike are Essox lucius, and they're considered what we call the type species for the genus. Which means that, at some point, some scientists somewhere sort of deemed that the northern pike was the species that like sort of best exemplified the traits of the species, or of the genus. And so, What are some of those traits? Long torpedo-shaped bodies are sort of the key thing that we think about when we're thinking of pike. They're sort of round in cross-section. But yeah, this really long, thin body, compare it to like an ocean fish, something like a barracuda is very similar shaped. It's a great shape for a predatory fish, which these guys very much are. They are sort of have a reputation for being like very aggressive predators, which is kind of an interesting thing because they're sort of, they're thought of like these like active like hunting chase down sort of things where, you'll hear people call northern pikes, for example, the wolves of the lake. Which I honestly don't know exactly what the like connection is there beyond just having like sharp teeth, I guess. They don't really operate in groups much. They, like I said, are ambush predators much more so than they are like chase down predators. Operate a lot more like a leopard or a mountain lion than a wolf, to be honest. But they are all primarily fish-feeding carnivores, so sharp teeth, great for gripping onto fish. You'll hear them called duck-billed heads, but they have sort of this pointed face to them. And they all have this set of coloration where they are sort of darker on top, but then they all have a very light belly, which is something that you see in a lot of, specifically like predatory fish. Honestly, you see it in a lot of fish in general, but especially predatory fish. Think about like a great white shark has a very similar color palette to this. And sort of the gist of it is that if you're in the water and you're looking down at a thing, you're looking down into the dark. And so being dark on top helps you camouflage for something that's looking at you from above. Whereas if you're looking at something from below, generally you're looking up into lighter water. And as such, the light-colored belly actually helps you camouflage because that's the way light permeation works. Less permeation, the deeper you go. So when you look down at a thing, you're looking into darker water, you need darker back. Looking up, you're looking into lighter water, you need a lighter belly. And I actually have a mounted northern pike here that I can use to kind of show that to you here. And so you can see we're looking at the belly here right now, and I'll make sure you guys over in the real audience get to see this too. So you can see we're looking at the belly, and you can see this light kind of cream color all along the belly. But then as soon as we flip it over onto the back, they don't have the plank strapped to them in the wild, but you see it's much darker, sort of greenish, almost kind of olive color for the back. You see that? And of course, again, exemplifying that long body that this group of fishes is known to have. We'll come back later. We'll talk about it a little bit more. And so yeah, the sort of running trend for these guys, like I said, they're mostly ambush predators. They like to live sort of on the edges of like sort of weed lines. They wait for stuff to swim by them, and then they lash out and snap at it. The sort of signature like northern pike, or I guess pike in general predation thing is you'll hear people talk about the S curve that they make, where when they're getting ready to strike, it's almost very snake-like, where their body will kind of adapt an S type shape. Let's see, I do here, where they'll sort of be in that sort of position when they're getting ready to hit a thing, and you'll even see this when they're like getting ready to strike even at a bait, because these are one experience you'll have when you're fishing for these guys a lot is that they do a lot of like following up. They stalk a little bit sometimes they stalk a little bit when you're fishing for them, and so an experience you'll have when you are fishing for these guys is you'll see a lot of them that'll like follow your bait right up to the boat and then dive under the boat when you get too close. Very common thing you'll see, and you'll very much experience like seeing that S curve as something that you'll spend much time fishing for pike, and you'll experience that, and triggering them to hit when they're following up is something that it's a technique that every northern and musky fisherman eventually has to learn, the figure eight motion to trigger them into striking. But we'll start with the grass pickerel here. And one of the kind of weird things about grass pickerel is how little they are. I think, at least definitely of the pike in Minnesota, but maybe the pike like in general, or maybe the smallest one. I said it's weird to catch them more than like a foot long. Most of the time, you're talking in the like 8, 9, 10 range is a lot more typical. Um, you tend to see them more in like moving water as well than you necessarily would associate northerns and muskies with being in. Um, and they have the sort of defining feature of them, the thing that like distinguishes them from like just like a small northern or a small muskie, where like you pull this out and you're like, oh, that's a pickerel, is the pattern on the side. Which the picture I have there doesn't show up very well, but maybe this one here. So then it almost in this drawing looks like kind of a similar pattern to the muskie. But I guess my association with it is it's much more like the northern pike sort of color palette, but almost like is a more musky type of pattern. It's also like, in my experience, much more like vividly patterned than a muskie is, where like when you pull a muskie out, seeing like this type of striping, like it's there, but it's not as like obvious as it is in our illustration that we've got here. Whereas with pickerel, and I guess my experience is more of a chain pickerel than it is with grass pickerel, but you know, sort of similar, sort of stripy, sort of squiggly line pattern on the side, but more in the, like I said, pike palette rather than the musky color palette. And yeah, just like the other ones, these are ambush predators. Obviously, if you're ambush predating fish, you got to do it to the scale of animal that you are. So these guys are hunting, you know, beer minnows and suckers and stuff like that that are small animals, smaller, you know, juveniles of other species. Especially in rivers, a lot of species of fish will like go up the river to spawn, and then the babies will move down into the lake after they hatch. And so these guys are sort of a main predator of very young, like juvenile fish. But also, like I said, just generally smaller stuff, and even things like insects and whatnot. You know, they're mainly fish eaters. That's true for all the pikes, but you know, it's rare for an animal to be like, oh, I only eat one thing. And so, you know, things like, you know, a crayfish, if it happens upon it, or insects, they'll eat that type of stuff too. Then I didn't even really put a fishing section in on this one. Like I said, I don't really know anybody who like actively fishes for grass pickerel. Like I said, I've caught them, but not in Minnesota. We lived in Kentucky and South Carolina for a while when I was a kid, and we would catch them down there. It was a fun thing with that pickerel. If you go back and, you know, occasionally I've met some like older folks, some of my, you know, like grandpa's friends basically, that I've heard people call pickerel like small northerns. I've heard people call those pickerels, and I was looking at that, and apparently it is just an old term for like juvenile northerns and muskies. People would call them pickerel, and that term just sort of bled into these guys because they basically look like a small northern. So pickerel, originally a term that referred to the juveniles of northerns and muskies, but got applied to these guys because they're little. But yeah, the old codgers in the neighborhood, every once in a while call them pickerel, I've heard. But okay, the northern pike. Yes, they're probably the fish that people think of when they think of pike, like the one that literally has pike in the name. And they are substantially larger than any of the pickerel species get, especially grass pickerel. The state record in Minnesota is 46 pounds, 12 ounces, which at that weight, you're probably talking about one that is like somewhere 45 plus inches, I would guess. I didn't look up the length on it, but it's not unheard of to catch these in the like 40 plus inch long range. Greenish sides, and then the like really signature like identifying northern pike thing is the sort of spots on the side. You think they're called bean shaped, sort of this cream color, green and cream, with the bean-shaped spots on the side. Sort of reddish or orangish fins is something that like is very signature northern pike as well. And then as far as like sort of general body shape, again, long and thin, and they are a lot thinner when they're young. There's a lot of nicknames that people have for like small northerns. I've heard people call them hammer handles, ladyfingers is one that I remember as a kid. A lot of people calling them. Instead, I grew up calling them hammer handles, but as I go talk to the old dudes down at the bait shop, and they'll have a million different nicknames for small northern pike, because of this sort of unique shape that they have, where it seems like their head grows a lot faster than their body does when they're young. And so with the little ones, like I said, they'll have this big head and sort of biggish tail on this really skinny little body. But then as they get bigger and older, the body fattens up and the head kind of stays the same size. Like when you see the really big ones, they tend to have a very sort of different type of body proportion. And as far as fishing for them, again, like the others, they're ambush predators. Pretty sight motivated. We talked about this a little bit with walleyes, where a lot of fish aren't relying necessarily on their sight a ton when they're tracking prey. Northerns are a great example of a fish that does use its sight relatively often. But what's kind of unique about them for a fish their size, and the thing that always made them really appealing to me as a sport fish, something to fish for, is that they exist in relatively shallow water. Similar to largemouth bass, where they're a big fish that you can find pretty predictably in, like I said, relative shallows. Generally, if you're fishing in the spring, summer, fall, you're targeting generally less than 20 feet of water, maybe I associate it more 12 to 15 range even, probably. Looking for weedy areas, and then you're just casting either over the top or along the edges of those weed lines. It's pretty common for them to want to hit their prey from below, and a lot of times they like to hit it from the side as well. So it can be kind of a tricky thing to actually get the hook set on them. You'll know when they hit, but a lot of the times, sort of one of the tricks of fishing for northerns is that they'll hit your bait on the side somewhere, not catch any of the hooks, so they'll hit it and then run, and then eventually what they do is they stop and they turn it and swallow it. And so you'll get it can be a frustrating thing when you're fishing for northerns, because like I said, you'll get these massive hits and be like, oh, it's time, gonna get a fight on. But then, like I said, all of a sudden you try and set the hook and you just pull it right out of its mouth because it didn't actually hit any of the hooks, because it hit it, here rather than up here. Happens a lot when you're ice fishing too. But yeah, because they're so visually oriented and because they tend to exist in the shallows, having very reflective baits is something that is very associated with northerns. Baits that are going to cause disturbances in the water and then also be reflective. Because you're high in the water column, there is usually sunlight going to be permeating into that level, so being reflective actually helps. You'll see these super reflective baits as a thing that people will use sort of all over the place. But you think about it, a reflective blade only works if there's light down there for it to be reflecting. And so if you're jigging in 30 feet of water, 40 feet of water, 50 feet of water, there's really no reason for your bait to be reflective, because what light is it going to be reflecting? They said northerns, and once we get to muskies, also muskies are an example of a time when having that reflectiveness is really handy, because it actually is going to be reflecting stuff, and it also does a good job mimicking sort of the reflectiveness of a lot of the fish that these guys would be hunting out in the wild normally. And so yeah, your classic northern bait is spoons. The red and white daredevil is the thing that I always grew up that was the thing that my dad and my dad's dad and my dad's dad all used to fish for these guys, is the classic red and white daredevil. But sort of spoons in general. Spinner stuff is also very much associated with them, because the spinners turn up the water a little bit more. They'll chunk up the water a little bit, cause a little bit more of a disturbance, mimic sort of an injured animal a little bit more. But then also the flippy part of it also has the reflectiveness. So I like those a lot. People associate these a little bit more with muskies actually than they do with northerns in my experience, but they work well for both, and from what I've actually fished. The other thing sort of associated with fishing for northerns and muskies especially is trying to do very long casts, and so that's one of the benefit of having, these spoons are heavy. And so when you're casting them, I mean, it feels great to cast them. That's honestly one of the parts that I actually really enjoy about fishing for these guys is, just getting your rod out, putting a pretty heavy bait on the end of it, and just tossing a bait 80 yards. It feels great. Because basically what you're trying to do is a lot of these guys, like I said, they're mostly trying to do ambush predation, which means they're not moving around themselves very much. A lot of the times when they're hunting, they're squatting in an area and waiting for stuff to move past them, and then they jump out and grab it. And so the more movement that your bait is doing, the further your bait is traveling, the more ground you're covering, the more likely you are to pass over the area where they're waiting to ambush you. And so yeah, big long casts, dragging it over the top of weed beds. It can be kind of tricky fishing for these guys because they're so associated with these pretty thick weed beds. You're gonna get used to getting your bait caught and stuff. You're gonna get used to even during the fights having stuff get tangled up in weeds. It's just part of the deal when you're fishing for especially northerns. But like I said, they're a great sport fish, a great fight, and like I said, very much worth it. Maybe my favorite thing to fish for. The other nice part about northerns is they're a very active, pretty active bite in the winter as well. Especially the thing I very much associate with fishing for northerns in the winter is, of course, tip-up fishing. And so tip-ups are sort of a fun thing that, honestly, I find not a lot of people do. Again, it's not a thing people really do for walleyes or crappies, so not very many people do it, seemingly, in Minnesota. But tip-up fishing, I find, is really fun. Basically, you set a line, and then you have your flag that is attached to a little mechanism here. You set the flag, you drop your bait down, you set the flag down, and then when something grabs onto the bait and runs with it, it triggers the flag to come up, and then you run over there, and then you're just reeling it in by hand, basically. You don't have a real fishing rod, you're just pulling in the line with your hands. Very fun, and like I said, something that is very much associated for northern pike fishing. They tend to be, I guess in my experience, a little bit more mobile in the winter than they are in the summer, which is kind of weird, because when you think about fish, you generally are thinking of them as moving around less in the winter. Weed patches go away or get drastically reduced, and so they end up having to move around a little bit more. What's kind of interesting about them, though, is that they do still stay pretty shallow. When we were talking about the bluegills and stuff like that, we're talking about, you can catch them in, 5-10 feet of water in the summer, but then if you're fishing for them in the winter, you probably want to drop down to 20-30 feet for bluegills and stuff like that. These guys, like I said, stay pretty shallow, and that's because one of the things that people, I guess, don't necessarily expect about them is that these guys actually do a lot of scavenging in the winter. They're finding stuff that's dead, and a lot of that stuff is going to find its way into the shallows, basically. And so when you're using tip-ups, you're usually, again, weird thing for ice fishing, a lot of the times you're not dropping near the bottom. Everything we've talked about so far, we've talked about jigging, and when you're jigging, you're almost always down near the bottom. Your standard's a couple inches, maybe a foot off the bottom for most stuff. But with these guys, you're sort of more orienting it towards the bottom of the ice. And so you're talking a lot of the times about, going a few feet below the ice, sort of upper half of the water column. Again, these guys like light. They want to be in areas where there is light, and so you want to be in the top half of the water column, basically. And a lot of the times in relatively shallow areas, again. Much shallower even than what you might expect. You're going into bays again where it's in the summer this is a 10-15 foot deep bay, and now we have 3 feet of water on top of it, and now I'm fishing in 8 feet of water with a bait that's because there's ice on it, and I'm just dropping my bait just a couple feet below the ice there, and a lot of times it works. But again, generally you're looking for areas where you're looking for what weedage you can find, and a lot of times you're trying to fish breaks for these guys. You're going into areas where they can move into a little bit deeper water, areas where shallow water and deep water are in close proximity to one another is generally just good advice as far as fishing for anything, but it holds true for pike as well. In the summer, you're usually using live bait. In the winter, you're generally using live bait as well, suckers being sort of the prototypical pike bait. Oh, and yeah, good thing I wrote that on there. Your inlets. Thing to be careful of if you're ice fishing. So when I say an inlet, what I mean is an area where a stream or a river is entering a lake. And you'll see a lot of fish end up sort of clustering around these areas because stuff that's getting sort of swept down the river is getting dumped into the lake. And there's a lot of times a lot of good nutrition in there. You get, especially if you're scavenging, you're getting like dead stuff that's coming down, you're getting insect larvae that are being swept down. You're getting all sorts of stuff that's moving into the lake in these places, so you'll see predatory fish kind of congregate in these areas. But of course, when you're ice fishing, these are areas to be very, very careful in, because a lot of times the ice isn't as thick here because moving water does not freeze as easily as stagnant water does. And so if you're ever fishing in areas where there are inlets, make sure that you have enough ice there, and be checking your depths when you get there, because what's true out in the middle of the lake is not going to be true near one of these inlets. And yeah. Wire leaders. I don't know if we can see if this guy's got one on or not. But a leader is like a thing you clip onto the end of your line that is usually like a little bit more heavy duty. And it's particularly important for things like northerns and muskies because they have very sharp teeth. And so a lot of the times if they, grab your line, it isn't always just a matter of like how hard they're pulling, but if they get the line in their mouth, a lot of times they can just cut it with their teeth. And again, we can look at my taxidermied friend here and take a peek inside his mouth. And see, he's got a lot of teeth in there, and he's got a lot of sharp teeth in there. And you can imagine if your fishing line gets in there, he's gonna be able to cut through it. And so, like I said, a wire leader is something that is sort of part of every northern muskie fisherman, especially ice fisherman's tackle box. All right, let's talk muskies. And so muskies are an interesting fish. They're a fish that has a lot of, like, I guess in my experience, a lot of sort of mystique around it. It's a fish that is referred to with a lot of like reverence by a lot of people. And one part of that is they're big. So what did we say the state record was for northerns? 46 pounds. The state record for muskies is 55. I think the world record is like 60 something. So these are big, big, big fish, especially for like as big of like a predator fish is. This is probably the second or third biggest fish that we have in Minnesota, period. And it's the only one that's like this type of like active, hunting type of predator. The things that would be bigger than it are things like sturgeon. We have lake sturgeon here. In fact, it's fishing time for lake sturgeon right about now. That can, easily get into the, 100-pound range. Paddlefish, we technically have in some parts of Minnesota, way down south too. I don't know if paddlefish get bigger than this or not, though. I would assume they do, but I guess I'm not 100% sure on that. But yeah, we're talking about a fish that is, like I said, potentially like up in the 50-plus pound range. That is, like I said, a big like hunting type of predator. And there's not that many of those, especially in fresh water. And when we're looking at a muskie, like telling the difference between a muskie and a northern is a thing that gets asked a lot, and it gets sort of exacerbated by the fact that they can hybridize with one another. You'll hear about tiger muskies, and generally when I'm looking at like a muskie versus a northern, the thing I'm really like the first thing I'm looking at is sort of coloration stuff. Whereas like I associate northerns with being green, whereas I associate muskies with being sort of a yellowish or brownish color more. Northerns also have like a pretty obvious pattern on the side with the spots. Muskies, can kind of see the like stripies on them, but a lot of the times they just sort of almost look like a flat, sort of almost like metallic, sort of coppery color is very much the muskie patina that I guess in my experience you're most likely to encounter. Fins also dramatically less patterned than what you see in northerns. Kind of similar color, that same kind of reddish orangish, but without nearly as many of the spotty things that you're seeing on them. So I'm sort of more like drab looking fish, I guess, overall. Like I said, almost has almost like this metallic color to it a lot of times when you're actually looking at it out of the water, in a way that northerns, I don't necessarily. They're all very shiny fish because they're very slimy. It's something that helps protect them from like infections and stuff like that. It also, I don't know if this is even true, but I know I've heard people say that like one of the reasons northerns are so slimy is it helps them like move through the water more easily to be faster. I guess that's a thing I like grew up hearing, but now that I'm like having to be in front of an audience speaking as like sort of an academic-y type of context, I'm like, I wonder if that's even real, or if that's just a fishtail. But yeah, yellowish colors. You'll see it's more of a stripe pattern to the side. I mean, you can see there's a little breaking that happens in it where it gets a little spotty, especially towards the back, but I associate more with stripes rather than spots, if there is like a noticeable pattern at all. And then kind of darker colored fins than what you've normally seen in northern with less pattern. And yeah, like I said, part of the mystique of these guys is how sort of low their population density is a lot of time. These are big fish, and so it's, it just can't sustain that many of them in a given lake a lot of the times because of how much, food they need to maintain themselves, how much space there is. And so one of the common, like, adages you'll hear about them is people referring to them as the fish of 10,000 casts because of how, like I said, uncommon it is to catch them. Muskie fishermen, like, there's a lot of dedicated muskie fishermen out there, and probably nobody catches fewer fish than those guys. But they catch a lot of big fish, and that's the appeal. And so when you're casting for muskies, the thing you're usually doing is you're casting very big lures. Like, you're talking about, stuff that's, probably 6, 7, 8, sometimes, depending on how heavy duty you're going, maybe foot-long lures that you're throwing out there. Because again, you're trying to, if you're somebody who is like trying to fish for muskies, you're fishing for big muskies. That's sort of, I guess, one of the differences here is because like the population density of them is so low, the people who are doing for it as like a sport thing are doing it for like the trophy rather than like going out and just like enjoying like fighting a fish and catching it and releasing it the way that somebody might for northerns. And so the people who are like actively fishing for muskies tend to be, like I said, like trophy fishing. And so they're casting very large lures because they're looking for very large fish. And again, similar type of environments to northerns. I say most muskies I've caught in my life have probably been ones I caught on accident while fishing for northerns. I have muskie fished a little bit, but like I said, it's similar to like the sauger thing where it's like, yeah, I've caught sauger, but I've never fished for sauger. I just catch them sometimes when I'm fishing for walleyes. And yeah, they, similar type of thing where you want to cast from a long ways away. They're sort of notoriously like spook easily. I don't know, again, whether or not that's true, but that's like the reputation they have, is that, if you get close to them with the boat, they'll spook off and not want to actually bite afterwards. And so you're casting from very far away, casting very large baits. The other thing about them is a lot of the times they'll be hanging out in like very shallow water. They sort of have this reputation for like sunning themselves, where they'll just be like sitting kind of right at the surface of the water. And so maybe this like reputation for spooking easily comes from that, is that they're oftentimes sitting in like such shallow water that people actually see them run off in a way that they don't always see with other fish when they get too close to them. But again, similar type of ambush predation, hanging out near weed edges, very similar type of strike pattern where they'll do the little S-curve thing and, lash out at a thing from below and try and hit it from the side and run with it and yada, yada, yada. Again, spoons people use for them. I guess in my mind, people more so than they tend to do for northerns tend to use stuff like, you can see this, the spinner kind of bucktail type of thing. A lot of people like to use for them. Again, stuff that is like creating a little bit bigger disturbance in the water is something that is sort of associated with them. Again, it's always so hard with a lot of these types of predatory fish to parse out what's real and what's not with them. But the other association, like I always grew up with them, is that they're a species of fish that is much more likely to hunt for like non-fish. They go for like muskrats and ducklings and that type of stuff that swims around on the surface, like warm-blooded stuff a lot more. which would maybe lean into why people tend to use like bucktails for them, is because they have that sort of furry element to it. I mean, I guess it makes sense. They're like a large enough predator that they could do something like that a lot of the times. You know, obviously the bigger ones. And because they're so close to the surface, they probably do more of that stuff than a lot of other predators would. But as far as like what percentage of the diet is for a given muskie is, you know, baby ducks, probably not much, I would assume. But again, it's sort of the reputation they have, and a lot of the times when you're actually when you're fishing, the like sort of common knowledge sort of fishing things are much more associated with the perceptions of fish than necessarily what the reality is. Again, we talked about this a little bit last week with like walleyes and how people treat animals that live adjacent to walleyes. These guys can also a lot of times be found in deeper water, so we can't do this in Minnesota, but in other states like Wisconsin, I guess, would be the most obvious one. It would be trolling for them, where you throw a bait out the back, something that can dive into a little bit deeper water, and then you just move around with your boat rather than actually casting. Again, not something we're allowed to do in Minnesota, but in other states, this is a thing that people will do for muskies, is, you know, drop, like I said, big bait off the back of their boat and just drag it around behind the boat. But yeah, as far as like what we can do in Minnesota, basically casting, same areas you would target for northerns, basically. Ice fishing, I don't know very many people who ice fish specifically for muskies, because again, like the population density is so low, and they're sort of in similar types of environments to northerns. Again, where you're looking for areas that are like shallows but near deep water, you know, it's sort of associated with like, find a hump that has some like weedy type of stuff around it, keep punching holes and dropping bait down there, and, you know, if you're lucky, maybe you'll catch a muskie by accident, is sort of the, in my experience, sort of general knowledge. I've caught them ice fishing, but again, it's always sort of been an accidental thing while you're looking for northerns, and again, typically associated with tip-ups. You don't see very many people that jig fish for them, just because the, like, the rods and lines that you're using when you're jig fishing are usually, like, not heavy-duty enough for this scale of fish. And so yeah, tip-ups tend to be the thing that people use for both northerns and muskies, and in my experience. And again, like I said, people call it the fish of 10,000 casts, and, you know, when you're out there tip-up fishing, you're not getting that many casts out there. So, you know, if you're going out there looking specifically for muskies, be ready to be disappointed, I guess, is sort of the main thing here. But yeah, I mean, that's, I guess one other quick thing we can talk about very briefly here. When we're talking about identifying, I mentioned a few ways, you know, telling them apart. One of the things that comes up a lot when you're talking about northerns and muskies as far as identification is you'll hear a lot of talk about pores, and what those are referring to. And you can kind of see them on this. They're sort of painted over in this taxidermy. But northerns and muskies both have a set of pores on the bottom part of their jaw. Let's see. You can see a few of them here. Like I said, a lot of them are kind of painted over on this particular taxidermy. But that's one of the things that people do look to as a, like, sort of pretty cut and dry way to tell the difference between them, is counting the pores. And muskies have more of them. It's not necessarily a consistent number that either northerns or muskies have, but generally speaking, like, I want to say it's like if they have 5 or lower, generally that's a northern. If they have 6 or more, generally that's a muskie. Tiger muskies, again, make it a little fuzzy, but that's like a thing you'll encounter a lot, is people, if you're like, you know, you're out there fishing and you catch a thing and you're like, is this a northern or a muskie? And you're, you know, Googling it on your phone. It's like, oh, count the pores. That's what it's referring to. But anyway, I think they're going to call that... We're just wrapping up down here. We're just wrapping up here.
Okay, sorry.
So I think we're going to call that a talk for today. Again, northerns, muskies, and next week, what are we going to talk about next week? We have, let's see, we talked sunfish, we talked bass, we talked walleyes, we talked northerns and muskies. How about, it's sturgeon season coming up. Let's talk some of the sturgeon and sturgeon adjacent fish. I'll decide exactly what that is, but we'll talk sturgeon and paddlefish for sure next year, or not next year, next week. Maybe I'll add a couple others in there too. But thank you guys for watching. I will see you at 10:30 a week from now.